Hi everyone and welcome to a new video. So in this video I'll be showing you how I made this Speak Now Taylor's version quilt. My previous two quilts were very big and it took me both over a month to assemble, and I didn't want to do that because I am supposed to be garment sewing like I said in my last video, but this was too good to not do. So I really tried my best to keep the pattern simple. Once you kind of understand the technique of foundation paper piecing, you can really make it intricate or simple as you can. And I really try to keep it minimalistic. I use raw edge applique for her facial features, so that's already just kind of a shortcut. If you look at the album cover, not much is happening either, so I could really distinguish between the black background, the purple dress, and Taylor herself. And I really wanted to make clear that her hair is curly, and I really did that in a low poly way, but I also really wanted to focus on the quilting aspect, and then I realized I could just make wavy lines to represent the curliness. So I kept the design as easy as possible, and kind of like how I did Midnight's section in the last quilt. Again, I really wanted to focus on the quilting part, so I wanted to use her lyrics again, because of course, Speak Now being her self-written album, the lyrics mean a lot to the fandom and to her. So I used Long Live and Enchanted, two of the pretty much biggest songs of the album, and then I would just add random things that I would like to do with my quilt. Also added the sections of which I would piece and the piecing order and the colors that I want to use. Some things were added after I pieced the quilt, so when I had all the colors, I could enlarge this image. I used Rasterbader, which also shows you how big your poster is gonna be, and that exports a PDF file which you then can reliably print and tape together. So after I assembled the poster, I made sure to trace the facial features with double-sided interface, and I set this aside for later, but now that the poster is still in its entirety, it's easier to just do that now. And then I cut down all the sections that I would have to piece, and as you can see, I made brown bold lines to distinguish between cutting lines and folding / piecing lines. And then I could get my fabrics. Kind of embarrassing, I wanted to work for my stash, but obviously I wanted to do this well, so I went out and bought more fabric, which I wasn't supposed to do, but oh well. But now just the repetition begins of pinning down the first piece of fabric, folding the lines that would be next, trim down the seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch, place it down on the second piece of fabric. Most of the times I just line it up to the seam allowance. I sew through the paper, I trim down the seam allowance again, and then I fold open the fabric and then continue with the other pieces until I have an entire piece. And as I said, I kept the design very easy, so I was very quickly done with this. I think I just needed 1 or 2 days. As you can see, I'm using a lot of beige and brown shades, and I could tell them apart, but while piecing it gets really hard to kind of keep them apart. So as you can see in the corner, I kind of made a piece of paper with samples of all the fabrics and also the colors, just to make sure I didn't mess things up. So I think the biggest challenge was actually having very large pieces. You would think it's easier because you don't have as many pieces to piece, but actually just placing and working with big pieces of fabric gets a lot harder when you're doing this. So as you can see with this purple part, I had to make sure I had a piece large enough. Then what I do is I fold over the next section that I have to piece, and then I make sure the entire piece is covered when it's laying down like this. But it's quite hard to keep everything stable, making sure everything stays, so lots of pinning. Foundation paper piecing is very repetitive. And it's most important to use the right colors. I messed up once and I was already just assembling the quilt, so I did have to unstitch those parts. So here's the full time lapse of me piecing everything. Chapters should be available, so you can skip ahead to the next part if you want to know what happens next. But if you like time lapses, then this is the perfect video for you. In this shot, you can really see the kind of the 3-point setup, which gets mentioned a lot in the sewing community or the quilting community specifically. I know that Just Get It Done quilts say this a lot, but really have that U shape where you can cut your fabric, you can sew the fabric, and you can press the fabric. So as you can see, I just go from my small ironing board to the cutting mat to the sewing machine. So I know that foundation paper piecing is a little wasteful, so as you can see here, so this is kind of the reality, that I do create a lot of scraps. I try to save a lot of the bigger pieces, and I actually have to go through my trash because I tend to drop small pieces that I actually need for my quilt into the pile. So once I'm finished, I can kind of see how everything looks like. So as you can see, I'm just like bringing the quilt together, but this is also kind of for me to see if I have all the pieces, and this is also where I discovered that I still needed a piece that I accidentally dropped in the trash. So now I'm gonna use all those pieces to make bigger pieces that I can sew together to end up with the quilt top. Because I trim everything down, I just really rely on the seam allowance to make sure everything lines up. A lot of FPP patterns just have the sewing allowance also just printed. So you would also be sewing through paper here. But again, I just like to save paper, and I also don't want to cut down the pieces by themselves. So I will be releasing this pattern, though obviously this is not a very nice pattern to make because of the large pieces, and it's a very minimalistic design. But obviously I will be adding the order of having to piece everything together to get the quilt top at the end. So I was occasionally also struggling with the tension, so you do see the threads pop up a little, so that's kind of unfortunate, but that's also something I'm still improving. So the nice thing about this minimalistic design was that there aren't many spots where you really had to match the seam to get this perfect seam that goes from one side to the other. There were only like 2 or 3 because I didn't really meet a lot of lines together. It's really fun to just keep placing the quilt parts on the ground to just see the progress of the quilt coming together. And that's also easy for me to see which parts I have to sew together to avoid getting a Y seam. And as you can see, the length of the seam that I have to make just keeps getting longer because, of course, I'm sewing bigger parts of the quilt together. I also use the lyrics to kind of meet the right checkpoints, but again, I'm still in the stage where not everything has to be perfect as long as the ends meet. And that's the quilt top. I know in the fandom a lot of faceless merchandise is very popular as well, so honestly you could also just quilt it like this. So for the text, which is pretty much the most interesting part of the quilt, I kinda messed up by printing the lyrics in a very light shade of gray because it would shine through for the lighter fabrics, but not for the darker ones. So I was looking for a way to transfer the lyrics onto the quilt. I used transfer paper, but in the end, I discovered that it's because of the light gray that I don't see the letters. So I had to go back, use a marker to go over all the lyrics again, so that I would be able to use the light box to trace it onto the quilt with a chalk marker. So a very fun aspect is the Speak Now in the old font on her arm, which is a reference to her touring Speak Now when she would write lyrics down her arm. And honestly, Speak Now, the original cover, is also just my favorite. So I had a high expectation for this one, and the expectations were exceeded. So as you can see, using the chalk pencil, the lyrics are bright enough for me to quilt over them later. So when I finished that part, I worked on my applique. So I used the double-sided interfacing that I set aside at the beginning, and I put them on the right colors. So red lips, black eyes. The eyebrows I could have gone a shade darker, but they're all right. And because of the double-sided interfacing, they basically become like stickers. So I have to cut out the right shape, and then I put them on the places where I went over with a colored pencil, using the light box again. Again, totally optional, because this design does work without the face as well. And like I said, it's a popular thing within the fandom. Maybe just a pop culture thing. So when I was finished with the applique, I could start removing the paper and get ready to sandwich the quilt. So this is some leftover bedding that I had from years ago. So it was also my goal for the quilt to be this size so I could use up, because bedding takes a lot of space. I'd rather use cotton, but this is polyester, but it's in my stash. I pin basted, and I could finally start quilting. I know usually you start from the inside to the out, so you don't get too many bubbles. But I was really determined to work on the lyrics because I was really looking forward to quilting this compared to my Eras Tour quilt, because with the Eras Tour quilt it was really about the piecing part, but here I really wanted to add the lyrics and the curls. So this is the real-time footage. So as you can see, I have to stop occasionally to make sure the fabric is still straight, to make sure I am going the right direction. When it's upright like this, it's quite easy because then it's kind of like writing. But when I go from backwards or upside down, it gets a little more disorienting. So to go to the next word, I would underscore again to create this edge-to-edge look. From far away, it also just looks like lines. So next up, I also quilted down the appliques. Really had to look closely, really watch the needle to make sure it stays within the applique. I had to redo this a few times because I was still kind of struggling with tension. I'm starting to understand my machine and its tension better, but it remains a very specific thing. I also think my machine prefers Medlar over Gutermann thread, so that's something I can also just kind of take into account for the future. So over here you can see me do the lips, which I really like doing because then they become puffy because of the quilting. And here you can see me do the speak now. Again, my machine did not like this thread, so I had to redo this. I think this was my first attempt. Also, this was a very light fabric, light thread. My colored pencil was showing a little bit too much, but obviously I also needed to because I was struggling to freehand the speak now. Then I could work on the dress, which had the Enchanted lyrics. And this time I was really happy to not be using the same colored thread as the fabric itself. Obviously with the black I did, and this purple is the shade of one of the purple fabric. But I also like being able to tell that these are lyrics. Unfortunately, I did have one small mess up that I don't want to fix, where my H in night kind of looks like a K, but those are very small things. So then I could make the curly hair. I started drawing out my design with chalk pencil. I wasn't too strict with this, but it was just important for me to kind of know which way the waves are going. I think I could have also, in the future I want to be a little more experimental, that I would have different widths and that they would end in a point rather than just parallel to each other. I think I secretly did for some of the parts, but for now I really wanted to just have parallel lines. And I started quilting this. For one side I went with a lighter thread, for the other side darker thread. I prefer the darker thread because again the tension was much better. After my previous quilt had so little quilting and my first one a lot, I was really happy to be quilting again because it's so precise, but at the same time you don't have to be. Like obviously I see a lot of my own mistakes, but in the bigger picture it's so well done, if I may say so myself. And it also just makes sense because the whole design is so polygony, so geometrical, while she has very curly hair. I think this was like the perfect balance that I could create. I personally quilt with polyester threads because I just like having my thread collection or thread stash as universal as possible. So with quilting the hair, the quilt is pretty much done. I really love how easy I kept. The design is easy, the lyrics turned out so pretty, and the hair just makes sense. So I was surprised how quick it went by, but I'm also very happy because this wasn't a project that I wanted to spend a lot of time on. I trimmed it down. It's not a perfect square. Then I made my own bias tape on the grain because of the straight edges. I ironed it myself. And I really wanted to go for this dark yellow color to kind of represent the golden frames that she used in the era. She used a lot of purple gold combinations. And obviously in the I Can See You music video, she also had this particular image framed. So to kind of get the golden frame vibes, I really want to use a decorative stitching to go over the entire edge. I chose one, I tested the size and then just went for it. Took a while, took a lot of stitches, it was very loud, but it was definitely worth it. It's also a very easy way to add extra detail with less work. The corners, I kind of messed them up. The one in the upper corner where it says long live was purely luck. that it turned out so well. I should have kind of learned how the pattern goes. So the other 3 are a little more messy. And the quilt is pretty much done. I got myself one of these sticky rollers because a lot of small pieces of threads get left behind. So as you could see in the design, I really wanted to add those paint splatters that represent the old album. So I actually spent a few hours beading, dotting all the I's and just spreading all those pearls. But I just hated how it looked. The proportion is off. So I'm just leaving this in for you to see where my mind goes. But in the end, I removed this because I do think in this case less is more. I might want to do it with black rocailles and purple rocailles to kind of dot all the I's, but that might be for a future quilt. And that's the quilt. I'm very happy how it turned out. It gives me a lot of joy. Also had a great reception for it on Reddit. So maybe you came from Reddit. In that case, thank you for your support. Tension-wise, it's still not a perfect quilt. I really want to work towards that. But for now, this being my 3rd quilt, I think I can be very grateful where my quilting skills are right now. I am currently waiting for Taylor to finish up the US leg. Today is August 5th. Big suspicions that 1989 will be released, will be announced this week or next week. So if it's a very nice album cover, I might make it into a quilt as well. I also had a different Speak Now themed project to celebrate Speak Now, but while I like the results, it wasn't really satisfying enough to make a video out of it. And I think this one really scratched that itch. Anyways, thank you again so much for watching. The pattern will be released soon, and then I'll see you next time.